Right 9. Yeah. What? When? Oh, yes. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Good morning, everybody. So, welcome for another wonderful Shabbat morning. We will begin on page 103 in the Sidur Lev Shalem. So, for Birchot HaShachar, please rise if you are comfortable. Baruch Adonai L'Olam Asher Nitzach B'Bina L'Avdim L'Layla Baruch Adonai L'Olam Shasani B'Tzamho Baruch Adonai L'Olam Shasani Ben Purim Baruch Adonai L'Olam Shasani Yisrael Baruch Adonai L'Olam B'Keach Yivrim Baruch Adonai L'Olam Yermim Baruch Adonai L'Olam V'Kir Asumim Baruch Adonai L'Olam V'Kir Baruch Adonai L'Olam Baruch Adonai Shasam Baruch Adonai L'Olam Ra'oi V'Raha Baruch Adonai L'Olam Israel V'Tifaraha Baruch Adonai L'Olam V'Toha Baruch Adonai L'Olam Kama Asher Hayyu Yapapai. Continue top of page 105. שאנחנו משלימים ערבים ערב בבוקר ואומרים כמה בכל יום שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני אחד. תשמעתי שיש המלך שחווה ושואפת תביא הקרנו ברוך אדוני מקדש שמך ברבי. We continue with one of the passages on page 110. Let's choose passage Aleph. We continue Kadrabanan, page 111. V'tgadal v'tgadash shemei Rabbi, v'amad yivrach v'rutei v'yamachote, בחייכון ובמתון ובחיי רחוב ישראל, בגאולה ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ונעשה, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתחלל שמי לקדושה ברכו. אלא מנקו בחתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, ואמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. על ישראל ועל אדונן ועל חמדיון ועל כל תלמידי תלמידיהם, ועל כל מאן דאלים באורייתא דין ואשרי הדין, וכל אתר ואתר. יהי לנו מקום שלום הרבה, הנה וחיץ הרבים וחיים ארוכים מזן הרווחה, ופתחה ממרם אבון דשמיא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה משמיא, החיים בהם עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום כלומר, הוא יעשה שלום, עלינו כל ישראל ועל כל ישוי תבל ואמרו אמן. We continue page 112 with Psalm 92, Psalm for Shabbat. Hagam Yom Shabbat Kodesh, Shabo Hayu Halavim, Umru V'Hamikdash, Mizmor Shir V'Ma Shabbat. Tzadik Ha'ifrach Be'eretz, B'Halam Yizkeher, Tum Be'Adonai B'Chatzornu Yafrihu, Od Nuvam Seifad, Shneim B'Ranim Yehu, L'Agir Ki Asher Adonai Tzivlo V'Lata Bo. We continue on page 120 with Psalm 30. Mizmor Shir Chantavayit Rabbi. Ahafam Miskim Holy, Ibn Simcha, when Pledom and Nilo, Amod. We continue the Morse Kash, page 21, if on morning or in Herzite, we rise. If Gadao, Adach, Amad, Yivra, Kutev, Malkute, the phone of Yomekon, Kayed, Hobit, Bagala, Vizman Karib, Yehi Shmi Rabba Mavarach, La'olam Al'omei Omaya, Yitbarach, Yishtabach, Yitbar, Yitumam Naseh, Yithadar, Yitale, Yithalal, Shmir Kirisha, Brechu, Le'ela Minko Berchata, B'Shirata, Tushbachaf, Nechamtai, Da'imah, Imru, Yehish Namar Rabba Shmira, Ayin Ahim Ba'akol, Ra'el Imru, Amen. Ose Shalom, Uyase Shalom, Alin Ba'akol Yisrael, Ba'akol Yishrei Tevel. We begin our Pesukei December on page 122, Baruch She'amar. Please rise if you are comfortable. Baruch Marayam, Baruch, Baruch Sefri Shivit, Baruch Shemo, Baruch Yosef, Baruch, Baruch Zayim, Baruch Shemo, Baruch Mala'aret, Baruch, Baruch Malabriyot, Baruch Shemo, Baruch Meshalim, Sachatov L'Reitav, Baruch, Baruch Elohim L'Netzach, Baruch Shemo, Baruch Kodom Etzil, Baruch Shemo, Baruch Hashem Olam, Adav. Ya'Kulamim, Hashem Bo'ar Ari Arish Mogadoho, Baruch Adonai, Melech Nola Batishbacho. You may be seated. We turn to page 126 at the break in the middle, where the new paragraph starts. Hoshia Hamecha, Uvarech et Nachlachecha, Urem, 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 Nasen, Urem, Nasen, Ad Ha'olam. Hoshia Hamecha, Uvarech et Nachlachecha, Urem, 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 Benasem, Urem, Benasem, Ad Ha'olam. Shinu Pikalarunai, Shinu Maginenu, Kivo Yismak Libenu, Kivo Yismak Libenu, Kivishim Kucho Batafun, Hoshia Hetamecha, Ukaref et Nachatecha, Ure, Mure, 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 Benze, Rembenatzad Haram. Continue, we jump ahead to page 136 for Asher. Shushavitzecha Odilucha Seba. We continue page 141 with Psalm 150. Hallelujah, 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 El Bekocho, hallelujah, hallelujah, Ki Yabuso, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, 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 Kashofar, hallelujah, hallelujah, never before. Hallelujah, 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 so hallelujah, hallelujah, meaning hallelujah, 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 till hallelujah, hallelujah, till true Kohan Shamate Hallelujah, Kohan Shamate Hallelujah, Kohan Shamate Hallelujah, Hallelujah, Kohan Shamate Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu Yamin, Baruch Zion Shechem Shalem Hallelujah. Baruch Elohim of Israel, Sani Flot Levajaho, Baruch Shem Kodol Elam, Melech Baruch Et Kol Haaretz, Amen Amen. We continue top of page 142, please rise to your Lord. Elohim שבחר באברהם ותאמר קצתיהם תשמע אברהם ומלך לבבו נאמן לפניך. והגבקר לפניהם, ויערוב בחיים ביבשה, ואת רודפם השלכתם צלעות, כמו אבן במים עזים, ויושענה במועדתם. אשר אלוהה אשר עשה את מצרים, ויראוהם את אדוני, ויאמינו באדוני משה עבדו. Psalm of the Sea, page 143. אז ישיר משה ובני ישראל את השיר הסוד לאדוני ויאמרו לאמור השירה לאדוני כי גאותך סוס ורוחו רמה בים עוזי וזמרת יהבה ויהי לי תשובה זה אלי וענבהו אלוהי אבינו ארננו אדוני איש מלחמה אדוני שמו מרכבות ברוב וחילו ירה בים ומבחר שלישיו תבואו בים סוף תהומות יכסומו ירדו צלות כמו אבן Adonai Yimbo Leolam Baher Adonai Yimbo Leolam Baher Kilamu Fam Shabloim Velumaj Martzion Mishpachar Sahab Vatabalayim Mufava Ya'adnai Maf'akoha Aretz Vaymahu Yenayafar Ushmo Echad. Be seated. We continue with Nishmat, page 145. Nishmat Kohai, Reflection Paranai, Eloheinu, Shabbat Baruch Shem Kochacha Kamor David Baruch Nafshi Et Adonai Bechokrai Et Shem Kochacho Ha'el B'Atma B'Zacha Hagato B'Chbod Shemecha Ha'libon HaTach B'Norah B'Morotecha HaMelech HaYoshev Kisei from Benisa. Our Shachrit service formally begins with Shofin Ad on page 147. I would like to invite Rabbi Kunin to continue. Thank you.
And if I don't announce a place where you traditionally stand, where with the minhag here, please feel free to stand despite what I say or don't say. Shochen ad maharom bekadosh shemaho. Befi yisharim tid halal, divrei tzadikim tid barach, ubelshon hasidim tid romam, ubkerev kidoshim tid kadash, umachalo revivot amcha beit Yisrael. Rina yeper shemcha malkeinu b'chol dor v'ador, shechen hovad kol drim lefanecha, Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, l'adol, l'halel, l'shabech, l'pe'er, l'romeim, l'adel, l'varech, l'alel chaleis, al kol divrei shirot patish b'chot, David ben Yishai, abdecha meshichecha. Please rise if you're comfortable for Yishtabach. Yishtabach shemcha la'ad malkeinu, ha'el ha'melech ha'gadol v'kadosh, v'shamayim v'aretz, ki lecha na'ed Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu. Shir shchal alal v'zemra oz memshla netzach, kedula gura, tila tiferet, kedusha malchut. Brachot v'chodaot, me'ata v'yad olam, baruch atah Adonai, El Melech Gadol Batihish Bachod, El HaHodaot, Adon Hanif La'od, Acher B'Shirei Zimra, Melech El Chei, Ha'olamim. Yekadal V'Yekadash Shemei Rabbah, V'Yamad Divrach Cherutei, V'Yamlich Malchutei, V'Chayachon Yom Echon, V'Yeduchol Beit Yisrael, V'Alav Zman Kariv, B'Emru, Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivorach, Le'olam Le'omaya, Yitbarach, Yitbarach, V'Yishtabach, Yitba'ar, Yitromam, V'Yitnasei, V'Yitadar, V'Yitalev, V'Yitalal, Shmei D'Kodisha, Richuhu, Le'la Min Kol Birchata, V'Shirata, Tushchata V'Nechamata, Ramba Oma, B'Emru, Amen. Baruch Hu et Adonai, Hamavorach. Baruch Hu Hamavorach, Olam Va'ed. Please feel free to be seated. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Yotzer or Vrei Choshech, Oseh Shalom, Uvarei et HaKol. Akol Yoducha, Akol Yishabchucha, Akol Yomru En Kadosh, Kadonai. Ein kerkecha v'ein zulatecha, efes biltecha u'mido melach. Ein kerkecha Adonai Eloheinu b'olam hazeh, v'ein zulatcha malkeinu chayei olam haba. Efes biltecha golenu mot HaMashiach, v'ein do melech Moshienu l'tchiyat hametim. We continue with the Piyut El Adon, page 151. El Adon al kol ha'ma'asim, baruch u'mvorach b'chol neshama, kol lo v'tuvo malei olam, da'at u'kuna sovevi moto, amiga el hayot ha'kodesh, mehed b'kavod al ha'merkava, zechu tu'mishor lifnei chiso, Chesed berachamim lifnei bodo, Tovi ma'orot shebara Eloheinu, Tzaram b'da'at b'bina u'chaskel, Koach u'gvura natan b'chem, Lechiyot moshlim b'kerev tevel, Male'im ziv u'pikim noga, Na'ezivam b'chol ha'olam, Smechim b'seitam v'sasim b'voam, Osim b'eim ha'retzon konam, Ba'er v'chavod notnim lishmo, Zohar laverina lezecher malchuto, Kara l'shemesh v'yizrach or, Rabbi Torah Kavana, Shevach notnim lo, Kol teva marom, Tiferet ugdula, Srafim va'ofanim v'chayot hakodesh. We're on the top of 152. La'el asher Shabbat mikol ha'maasim, v'yom hashviti lal yeshev kisei kivodo, Tiferet ata l'yom menucha. Titbarach Moshienu al shelach maseh yadecha v'omrei or shesita yeparuch hasela. On top of the following page. Titbarach surreinu malkeinu v'goaleinu borei kedoshim yishtabach shimcha la'ad malkeinu yotzer meshartim l'shem meshartav kulam omdim barum olam Mashmim b'yira yachad v'kol divrei Elokim hayim u'melech olam kulam ahuvim kulam berurim kulam giborim v'kulam osim be'imam raraton konam v'kulam potachim et bichem betushat Torah v'shira v'zimra u'mevrachim v'shabachim u'barim artim makdishim u'mamlichim Et Shem Ha'el HaMelech Gadol Gibon Ora Kadosh Hu V'chulam Mekablim Aleichem Ol Mechutrem Zeh Mizeh V'notnim Reshut Zeh Lezeh L'Akdishotam B'nachat Ruach V'sapa Bura V'rima Kedosha Kulam Kechad Onim Yomim V'yirah. Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzivaot Maloch la'aretz kivodoho, v'panim v'adkash rash gadol min asil matzrapim, u'matam v'shavachim ve'omrihim. Baruch kibod Adonai, mihim komoho, le'el baruch mimod yitenu, l'melchai v'kayam, mirot yomeru tishbachot yashmiyu kihu levado, well giburot oseicha tishot, al milchamot zorei tzedakot, madmiach yeshuot, Orei refuahod, Nora tehilot, Adon hanif la'ohod. Amechadesh betuvo b'chol yom tamid, Ma'aseh b'reshit kamor, Lo se'orim gidolim, Ki le'olam hastoho, Or chadash, Al tziyom ta'ir, Or chadash, Al tziyom ta'ir. Or chadash, Al tziyom ta'ir, Or chadash, Al Tzion Ta'ir, Benizke Hulanu, Mehera Le'oro, Benizke Hulanu, Mehera Le'oro, Baruch Atah Adonai, Yotzer Hama'oro, Avad Rabba Avtanu, Adonai Eloheinu, Hem lagidola v'teira, Amalta aleinu, Avinu malkeinu, Ba'avor abotenu v'imotenu, Shevatchu b'cha, Avinu meinu, Batimtenu kechayim, Kein techonenu manenu, Avrachaman, Achem rachem aleinu, V'tein libenu lahavim, Ochaskil lishmoa, Elmodu lelamei, Lishmor belasot, Ulkayem ekol divrei, Talmud Torah techa ba'ava. V'ha'ereinu b'toratecha v'dahapek b'beinu b'mitzvotecha v'yached levaveinu v'yahava u'yira et shemecha v'lo nevosh le'olam ba'ed v'lo nevosh le'olam ba'ed Ki b'shem kodshecha hagadol v'hanora b'tachnu nagila v'nismecha v'shuatecha. On the bottom of 154, as we gather our tzitzit in preparation for the Shema. V'chavienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot haaretz v'tolichenu kol memiut le'artzeinu ki el poel Yeshuotata uvanu v'charta mikolam b'lashon Kerab tanu shimcha chagadol bela sela behemet lehodot lecha uyachedcha be'ahava Baruch atah Adonai v'cher b'mo Yisrael ba'ahava Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, v'chol levacha, v'chol nafshecha, v'chol me'odecha, ve'hayu ha'barim ha'eleh. Asher anochi mitzavcha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shiftecha b'veitecha letecha v'derech u'shoftecha v'kumecha u'shartam liot al yadecha v'yu etotafot bein einecha u'taptam al mezuzot beitecha u'v'sha'arecha. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, Daber el Bnei Yisrael v'amart alechem, Yasu lechem tzitzit, al kampei b'dechem ledorotam, v'natnu al tzitzit, hakanaf patil dechelet, v'lechem letzitzit, ritem oto, sfartem et kol mitzvot Adonai v'asitem otam, lo taturu, achrei levalchem, achrei nechem, Ashetem Zaprechem, Leman Diskeru, Vasitem Ekol Mitzvotai, Vitem Kiroshim Leloechem, Ani Adonai Eloechem, Shechotzeti Etchem, Me'eretz Mitzrayim, Yot Lachem Lelohim, Ani Adonai Elohechem Emet, Adonai Elohechem Emet. We're on the bottom of page 156. V'yatziv Nachon v'chayam v'yashar v'ne'eman b'ahu b'aviv v'nechmad b'na'im v'norah v'yadir v'metukam v'kabel v'tov yafeh v'davar hazeh aleinu le'olam v'ed emet Elohei olam malkeinu shel Yaakov magen yishenu l'dor v'dor hu kayam u'shmo kayam v'chiso Nachon u'malchuto v'emunato la'ad kayamet. Udivarav chayim v'kayamim. Nemanim netmadim that omei olamim. Al avotenu v'imotenu v'aleinu v'al banenu v'al dorotenu v'al dorot zera Yisrael v'adecha. Al rishonim achronim dvar tov v'chayam v'olam ba'ed. Emet b'menachot v'lo yavor. Emet shetach Adonai Eloheinu v'elo hey avotenu v'imotenu. Malkeinu melech avotenu v'imotenu. Golenu goel avotenu v'imotenu. Trainu tzor Yeshuatenu. Hodenu matzilenu me'olam shemecha ein Elohim zulatecha. And we're on page 157. Ezra davotenu v'imotenu atahu me'olam magenu asher v'nechem acharechem v'chol dohor v'adohor. We're going to continue now in the middle of page 158 with Micha Mocha, and Micha Mocha leads directly to the Amidah. So we stand towards the middle of the prayer, and then once Micha Mocha is continued, we move immediately into the silent Amidah. Tilo le'el elyon, baruchum korach, Moshe Miriam, Ubnei Yisrael, lechanu shir simcha rabbah, yamru chulaham. Micha mocha Elim Adonai Micha mocha Nedar b'kodesh Nora tehilo Osei pele Shira chadasha Shebechu geulim L'shimcha Al sefatayam Yachad kula Odu bechimlichu Please rise if you're comfortable. Adonai Yimloch Leolam Va'ed Zor Yisrael Kuma Be'ezrat Yisrael Uvdechnu Mecha Yehuda V'Yisrael Go Aleinu Adonai Tzvaot Shemo Kedosh Yisrael Baruch Atah Adonai Gal Yisrael. So we're going to continue now with the repetition of the Amidah. If you haven't completed the Amidah silently, please continue as we begin the repetition. It starts on page 159. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, Elohei Avoteinu, V'Eloteinu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, El Hagadol, Hayibor B'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Hasadim Tovim, Mekonei Hakol, V'Zocher Chatei Avot B'Ho, Umevi Goel Ibnei B'Nehem, Leman Shemo B'Ahava, Melech Ozef Kedo Moshiach Umagen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Abraham Poked Sa, Atah Gibor Leolam Adonai, Nechayei Metim Harav LaHoshia, Morid Hatal, Mechalkel Chayim Bechesed, Mechayei Metim Berachamim Rabim, Zomek Noflim Be'opech Olim, Umatir Asurim, Kayem Emunato, Lishenei Afar, Nichamocha Bal Gevura, Umidom Melach, Melech Meimi, Umechayei, Umatzmiach Yeshua, Ne'emanata, Ahayometi, Baruch atah Adonai, Mechayei Ameti. Nekadesh Yechabi Olam, Keshem Shemati Shimoto B'Shmei Marom, Kakatu Bayad Nebiecha, Korezeh Al-Zeh V'Amar, Kadosh Kadosh Kadosh, Siva Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzivaot, Melech La'aretz, Kevodo, Az B'Kol Rash Gadol, Adir V'Hazak Mashmi'im Kol, Min Asim L'Matzratihim, L'Matam Baruch Yomeru, Baruch Adonai Kohomo, Baruch Adonai Kohomo, Minkom Chamaken Yevetim Lo, Aleinu, Ki Mechakim Anulach, Maitim Lo B'Tziohon, Rabbi Amenu Le'olam B'Edish Gohon, Tihit Gadal, B'Tihit Kadash, B'Tov Yerushalayim Ircha, B'Dor V'Dor, B'Dor V'Dor, U'Netzach Netzachim, B'Yenenu Tirena Malchutecha, Kadavar Amor B'Shirei Uzecha, Al Yedei V'Shiach Tzilecha. Hallelujah. The Adonai Le'olam Elohai Edon, the door by door. Hallelujah. The door by door. Nagi Godma. Netzach Netzachim Kivushatcha Nakdish. B'Shifcha Eloheinu Mipino Le'Shevet Le'olam Ba'ed. Ki El Melech Gadol V'Kadosh Atah. Baruch Adonai Ha'el HaKadosh. Please feel free to be seated as we continue with the repetition on page 162. Bismach Moshe b'matnat Koho, Ki Eben Neman karata lo, Kalil ti'perosho natata, Yamdo lepanecha al har Sinai, U'shnei luchot avanim ohi b'yad, V'chatu b'chem shmirat Shabbat, Chatu b'chem shmirat Shabbat, V'chen katu b'toratecha. V'shamru Bnei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asot et HaShabbat Le'rot B'ridolam V'shamru Bnei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asot et HaShabbat Le'rot B'ridolam B'nai Bnei Yisrael, Oti le'olam, Oti le'olam. V'shamru Bnei Yisrael et HaShabbat, La'asot et HaShabbat le'dorotam b'ridolam. Yishesh yamim asa Adonai et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. V'shamru Bnei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asot et HaShabbat le'dorotam b'ridolam. V'yom ha'shvi Shabbat v'yinapash Shabbat v'yinapash V'shamru Bnei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asot et HaShabbat le'dorotam b'ridolam. Tato Adonai goyei haratzot, Elohim chato alkeinu, l'avdei tesilim, Gamuchato yishkeinu arelihim, Kili Yisrael amcha, Matato bi'aba, Zera Yaakov asher bam b'charta, Am mekadeshei shiv'i, Kulam yisba'u yetamgu mituvecha, V'ashvi Yisrael v'kidasho, Hem dad yamoto karata, Zecher ma'aseh v'reishit. Eloheinu, Elohei Avoteinu, Ritzei, B'mnuchateinu, Hadshenu b'mitzotecha, B'tel b'toratecha, Sabeinu metuvecha, V'samteinu b'shuatecha, V'ta'eribeinu, V'avdecha be'er. Chachileinu Adonai Eloheinu Ahava uvratzon Shabbat Kodshecha V'yanuchu v'Yisrael Mekadshei Shemecha Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat V'tzei Adonai Eloheinu Amchi Yisrael U'pilatam V'shev Eldal B'beitecha U'pilatam Bava Tikabel B'ratzon U'tilu Ratzon Tamid Avodat Yisrael Amecha V'techezena Eineinu V'shucha L'tzion B'rachamim Baruch atah Adonai Amachazir Shchinato V'esiyoho Moti manachnu laha Shetach Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu v'Imoteinu Ve'olam va'ed Sor hayinu magen yishenu Atal dor v'adorno Elachad Nesaredu atecha Al hayinu Yisrael Al nishmotenu p'kadot laha Al nisech shokol yomi manu v'al mitlotecha v'tovatecha Kol eit erev al tzahorayim Atol chilo chalura mecha Amrachem Ki lo tamu hasadecha Me'olam kevihinu laha Yakulam yitbarach b'ramam shemcha malkeinu Tamid e'olam va'ed V'chol chayim odu chasa V'aluk shemcha be'et Ha'el shvateinu be'ezrateinu sela Baruch atah Atov shechalachana lehodoho. For those who just came in, we're on page 165. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu v'Imoteinu Orcheinu bracha mishulashet Torah Atuba al yedei Moshe Abdecha, Rapi Aharon Uvanav, Kohanim, Am Kidoshecha Ka'amor, Yevarech Adonai v'yishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'huneka, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Sim shalom. Sim shalom tova uvracha ba'olam. Sim shalom tova uvracha. Ein v'chesed v'rachamim leinu b'al kol Yisrael amecha. Barucheinu avinu lanu kechad. Bior panecha, sim shalom, sim tova ba'olam, sim shalom, tova uvracha, ki bior panecha natata lanu, ay Eloheinu, Torah Ahim B'Avad Chesed Tzedakah Uvracha Rachamim B'Chaim V'Shalom. Sim Shalom. Sim Shalom Tova Uvracha Ba'olam. Sim Shalom Tova Uvracha Tov Be'einecha Varech et Amcha Amcha Yisrael Bechol Eit Ubechol Shah B'Shlomecha Sim Shalom Tova Uvracha Ba'olam Sim Shalom Tova Uvracha Baruch atah Adonai Baruch Amo Israel Shalom. And we continue now with page 167. Yikdav Yikdash Meba Yama Yivarach Yiruteh V'Yamlich Malteh V'Chayachon Yachon Chayirachol Beit Yisrael V'Zman K'Vemru Amen Yehei Shmei Rabba Mivorach V'Yolam Yom Yomah Yivarach Yivarach Man B'Naseh Yivarach Lev Shmei D'Kodesh B'Yichud Kol Chata Tushchata B'Nechemata Ramba Amar V'Emru Amen Tikabel Tzotah B'Hon D'Koshreel Kadam B'Hon V'Emru Amen Yehei Shlomo Rabbi May V'Chaim Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael V'Emru Amen Oseh Shalom B'Ramav Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael Kol Yoshvei Tevel V'Emru Amen. And we continue now with the service for taking the Torah from the Ark, which is found on page 168. Are you reading this or? Oh, good.
Ein kamocha ba'Elohim Adonai, ve'ein k'ma'asecha, ma'u v'kamahu, olamim, u'nemshaltecha b'chol dor v'dor. Adonai melech, Adonai malach, Adonai yimloch, le'olam va'ed. Adonai rosh le'olam yitrein, Adonai yivarech, ve'ol Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonai, Gadol Shema.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonai, Gadol Shema.
Adonai, U'Elohim, Jeremiah,
You may be seated. This week's Parsha, this week's Torah reading, we read from the book of Deuteronomy, from the Parsha, this week's Parsha is Eikev. The Torah reading begins on page 1048, beginning at chapter 10, verse 12.
ויעזור, וישיר לכל החוסים באבין אמר אמן. הכל הגבוה לאלוהינו נרחבות לתורה, כהן קרב יעמוד, הרב אלכסנדר וולף בן אברהם ושרה הכהן, ברוך שנשא תורה לעמו ישראל בקדושתו, ואתם הדבקים אדוני אלוהיכם,
חיים כולכם היום. Baruch et Adonai Amvorach. Baruch Adonai Amvorach Elam Va'ed. Baruch et Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch et Adonai noten Torah.
Amen. Vata Yisrael ma Adonai Elohecha shoel mimach kim yirah et Adonai Elohecha lelechet b'kolchav v'ahava oto v'lavot et Adonai Elohecha v'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'shmor et mitzvot Adonai v'etukotav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom tov lach Heim Adonai Elohecha hashamayim ushmecha hashamayim haret v'kol asher ba rach bavotecha Hashach Adonai lahava otam vayivchar b'zaram arechem v'chem mikol ha'amim chayom hazeh.
Baruch et Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natav betocheinu. Baruch et Adonai noten Torah.
Amen.
יעבוד משה בן חיים הלוי ויהודי.
The second Aliyah continues, page 1049, verse 16.
Baruch hu Adonai Hamborah.
Baruch Adonai Olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Hamborah Olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah.
Amen.
Amen. Umaltem arlat levavchem v'arpechem lo tikshu od. Ki Adonai Elohechem hu Elohei ha'Elohim v'Adonai ha'Adonim ha'el ha'gadol gibor v'norah asher lo yisaf anihim lo yikach shochad oseh mishpat yatom v'almana v'achev ger letet lo lechem b'simah avatam et hager ki gerim hayitam be'eretz Mitzrayim et Adonai Elohecha tira oto ta'avod u'ot tidbahak Uveshmo tishaveya hu tilatcha v'hu Elohecha asher sa itcha et gedolot v'tonorota ele asheru einecha v'shivim nefesh yardu avotecha Mitzrayma v'yata simcha Adonai Elohecha kovei hashamayim la'arov.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam natav b'tocheinu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Tamar bar harav Daniel v'shira shlishi.
Baruch et Adonai Hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha v'shamarta mishmarto v'chukotav mishpatav mitzvotav kol hayamim v'yidatem hayom ki lo etnechem asher lo yad'u v'asher lo ra'u et musar Adonai Elohechem et golo et yado chazaka uzro'o hanetuyah bet ototav bet masav asher asa b'toch Mitzrayim leparo melech Mitzrayim u'lechol artzo v'asher asa v'chel Mitzrayim lesusav u'lerichvo asher hitif et mei yam suf al pneihem v'rodfam achareihem v'ya'avdehem Adonai ad hayom hazeh v'asher asaha lachem במדבר עד בוכם עד מקום הזה כאשר עשה ונתן לאבירם בני אליהו בן ראובן אשר פצתה הארץ את פיה ותיב להם ואת בתיהם ואת אהליהם ואת כל היקום אשר ברגליהם בקרב כל ישראל כי עיניכם הרואות את כל מעשה אדוני הגדול אשר עשה ושמרתם את כל המצווה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום למען תחזקו ובאתם רשתם את הארץ אשר אתם עוברים שמה לרשתה ולמען תאריכו ימים על הרמה אשר נשבע אדוני לאבותיכם לתת להם ולזרעם ארץ זבת חלב ודבש.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. The reading continues at the bottom of page 1051 at verse 10. Yamod,
Oshi Yosef,
Oshi Yosef,
Yitzchak,
Yitzchak,
Devorah.
Devorah, Rabbi.
Baruch Adonai HaBaruch.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai HaBaruch Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'nasan lanu es toraso. Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah. Amen.
Amen. Ki haaretz asher atah bashama l'rishtaha lo k'eretz Mitzrayim hi asher yetzatem misham asher tizra et zaracha v'ishkita beraglecha k'gan hayara ve'aretz asher atem ovrim shama l'rishtaha eretz harim uvkaot v'machar shamayim tishtamayim Eretz asher Adonai Elohecha dorish otaha tamid. Einei Adonai Elohecha baha mireshit hashanaha baha akarit shanaha.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher nosan lanu Torah emes v'chayei olam notav sochenu. Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah.
Amen. Our reading continues at verse 13 in the middle of page 1052. Yamod, Benjamin Lev, Ben Abba Yosef, Chamishi.
Baruch Adonai HaBaruch. Baruch Adonai HaBaruch Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'nosan lanu es toraso. Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah.
Amen.
Amen. Behaya im shama tishma'u el mitzvotai asher anochi metaveh etchem hayom lahava et Adonai Elohechem u'la'avdohu b'chol lavchem u'b'chol nafshechem v'natati mitar artzechem ito yoreh u'makosh v'asavta digancha b'tarecha v'natati es Techa v'esavata.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher nasan lanu Torah semes v'chaye olam ota bezoheinu. Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah.
We're going to pause at this point to recite a Mishaberach for those who are ill. If you have a name that you would like to add to our list, please rise at this time. Mishaberach Avotenu Abraham Yitzchak Yaakov Imotenu Sarah Rivka Rachel Leah Hu Yivarei V'Yarfei Kol HaCholim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yimalei Rachamim. These are the names that we have for this week. Havasara Bat Basha Ukunkas, Esther Neshama Bat Sarah Arham, Esther Tenenbaum, Esther Bat Arham, Diane Kazalka, Judy Potofsky, Marissa Wall,
Cyrus David Berger, Harriet Librarian, Joanne.
thank you. Is there anyone online? Let's see. Let's see. The Hera Rukuat Shalema, Mina Shemai, Rukuat Hanefas, Rukuat Hagu, the Tulsa Arkole, the Chazek, Ejide, Haoskim, the Tsarechem, Shabati, Belize, Oka Rukuat, Rova, Lavo, Hashkaba, Agala, Rimakari, and Omar. Amen.
The sixth Aliyah continues in our 8th Chaim Chumash, beginning chapter 11, verse 16.
Hamod Leabat, Simava Aaron, Shishi. Baruch Hu et Adonai Hambarach. Baruch Adonai Hambarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Adonai Hambarach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah. Amen.
Amen. Hishamru lachem, pen yifatel levavachem, v'saftem, va'avadetem Elohim achirim, v'hishtachavritem lahem. V'charaf Adonai bachem, Atzar et hashamayim v'lo yiyeh matar v'ha'adama lo titein et yavula va'avadetem mehira me'al ha'aretz ha'tuva asher Adonai noten lachem. V'samtem et devarai ele al levavachem ve'al nafshechem וקשרתם אותם לאות על ידיכם, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניכם. ולימדתם אותם את בניכם לדבר בם, בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך, ובשכבך ובקומך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען ירבו ימיכם בימי בניכם על האדמה אשר נשבע אדוני לאבותיכם לתת להם כימי השמיים על הארץ.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם אתה בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. אמן.
יעמוד יונדב בן גדליה ואילנה
The
השביעי.
seventh Aliyah can be found, page 1053, starting at verse 22. Baruch Adonai Baruch Baruch Adonai Baruch L'olam Va'ed Baruch Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato Baruch Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Ki im shamor tishmarun et kol hamitzvah hazot asher anochi metzaveh etchem la'asota le'ahava et Adonai Elohechem la'lechet bechol derachav uladavakabo. Behold, Rish Adonai et kol hagoyim ha'ele milifnechem, birishatem goyim gedolim va'atzumim mikem. Kol makom asher tidaro kacharag lechem bo'olachem yeh min hamidbar v'halvanon min nahar petrat ve'ad hayam ha'acharon yeh gevul lechem. Lo yityatzv ish bifnechem, pachtachem umora'achem, yiten Adonai Elohechem. Al panei chol haaretz asher tidrechuva, ha'asher diber lachem.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam ta'profenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Please rise.
Yikadal v'yikadash shemei Rabbi, v'yamad yivrach yirivtei v'yamlik nachutei, v'chayei hodu yomecha, v'chayei b'chol Beis Yisrael, v'agala v'bizman ha'ariv v'yamaru amen. Yeheshmei Rabba Mevorach, Le'olam lo me'amaya, Yivarach. Yivarach וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומן ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי לקודשה לעילם מן כל ברכתה ושירתה
תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירן בעלמא
ויאמרו
You may be seated. We continue with our Maftir Aliyah. We found again page 1053. We repeat starting at verse 22.
Namo Harav David Aharon then Levi the Torah here.
Baruchu et Adonai Hambarach.
Baruch Adonai Barak Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Barak Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Ki im shamar tishmarun el kol hamitzvah hazot asher anochi metzaveh etchem la'asota le'ahava et Adonai Elohechem lalechet bechol derachav Uladav kavod Behorish Adonai El kol hagoyim ha'ele milifnechem Virishatem goyim Edolim va'atzumim mikem Kol ha'makom Asher tidaro kavrach lechem bolachem yeh min hamidabar v'halvanon min hanahar nahar hara ad hayam ha'acharon yeh gevul lechem Lo yitsev ish bifnechem pachadechem u'mora'achem yiten Adonai Elohechem al panei kol ha'aretz al panei kol ha'aretz asher tiderechuva Asher diberachem.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen. Yamor Baruch ben Zion ben Michael v'Leah Batamor U'Miriam v'Avraham v'Sara v'Ilah v'Yisrael.
As as the Torah is seated, so too you may be seated. We turn to our Haftorah, which can be found in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, starting on page 1056.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'ratza b'divreihem הנאמרים באמת. ברוך אתה אדוני הבוחר בתורה ובמשה עבדו ובישראל עמו ובנביאי האמת והצדק ותאמר ציון עזבני אדוני באדוני שכחני התשכח אישה עולה מרחם בן ביטנה גם אלה תשכחנה ואנוכי לא אשכחך אין כל כפיים הכותיך ומותייך נגדי תמיד מיהרו בנייך מהרסייך ומחריבייך ממך יצאו שאי סביב עינייך וראי כולם נקבצו באו לך היי אני נאום אדוני כי כולם כאדרי תלבשי ותשרים כחלה כי ערבותייך ושומותייך בארץ אריסותך כי אתה תתרי מיושב רחקו מעלייך עוד יאמרו באוזנייך בני שכולייך צר לי המקום גישה לי ואשבה ואמרת כלבבך מי ילד לי את אלה ונשלחו לה בגל מודה קולה בסורה ואלה מי גידל הן אני נשארתי לבדי אלא איפוכם כה אמר אדוני אלוהים הנה אשא על גויים ידי ועל עמים ערים ניסי והביאו בנייך בחוצן ובנותייך על כתף תנשאנה והיו מלאכים אומנייך ושרותיהם מניקותייך אפיים ארץ ישתחו לך בעפר רגלייך יהלכו ידעת כי אני אדוני אשר לא יבושו קווי היו כך מגיבור מלכוח עם שבי צדיק ימלא איכו אמר אדוני גם שבי גיבור יוקח ומלכוח ארית ימלא ואת יריבך אנוכי אריב ואת בנייך אנוכי הושיעה והלכתי את מונייך ואת בשרם וכעסים דמם ישכרון וידעו כל בשר כי אני אדוני מושיעך וגואלך אביר יעקב כי רוצו מכל אמר אדוני איזה ספר כריתות עמכם אשר שלחתיך או מינו שי אשר macharti etchem lo hein bavnotechem min kartem v'peshechem shochat imachem Madua bati ben ish karati ben oneh aksor kitzara yadi mipiduhud ve'im ein bikoach batzihil hein begarti achariv yam Asihim naharo midaber tiv ahash dagatam me'emayim v'tamot v'tzamaha al bishamayim v'ruhut v'sahak asim kisutam Adonai Elohim natan li lashon limudihim Ladahat laut et yaev davar yair baboker yair li ozen lishmoa kilimudihim Adonai Elohim patach li ozen vanochi lo mariti ahor lo nisugati Davi natati lemachim ulchayai lemortihim panai lo istartihi miklimot barok Adonai Elohim Ya'azar lihi al kain lo nichlamtihi al kain samtihi banai kahalamihish ba'edah ki lo ebosh karo amitzdikihi miyarib itihi naamda Yada Yachad Mibaal Mishpatihi Yigash Elai Hein Adonai Elohim Yazar Lihi Mihu Yarshi Eini Hein Kulam Kebeged Yivluhu Ash Yochlem Mibachem Yerei Adonai Shomei Kol Abdoho Asher Allah Hashechi Beino Galoho Yivtach B'Shem Adonai Vayish Ein Velohav Hein Kulchem Kod Chei Eish Mazrei Zikohot L'chu Or Eshchem Uzikot Ba'artem Miyadi Haitazoh Lachem Lama'atzeva Tishkavu Shimu Elai Rod Beit Tzedek Mivakshe Adonai Abitu El Zohor Kutzav Tehem Vel Ve'el Makevet Bor Nukartem Abitu El Avraham Avichem Vel Sarah Tacholechem Mi'echad Karativ Ba'avar Rachehu Ba'arbehu Kinicham Adonai Zion Nicham Kol Harovotecha Vayasem Midbarak Ke'eden Ba'arvata Kegan Adonai Sason B'Simcha Yimatzei Vaha Toda V'chol Zimra Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, tzor kol haolamim, tzadik b'chol hadorot, האל הנאמן האומר ויעשה, המדבר ומקיים, שכל דבריו אמת בצדק. נאמן אתה אדוני אלוהינו, ונאמנים דבריך ודבריך נדבריך, אך לא ישוב ריקם, כי אל מלך נאמן ורחמן אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, האל הנאמן בכל דבריו. רחם על ציון כי ביתנו, ולובת נפש תושיע במהרה בימינו, ברוך אתה אדוני, משמח ציון בבניך. שמחנו אדוני אלוהינו, אליהו הנביא עבדך מלכות ביתך ביד משיחך, במהרה יבוא ויגל ליבנו, על כיסו לא ישב זר, לא ינחלו אחרים את כבודו, כי בשם קודשך נשבעת לו, שלא יכפה נרו לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן דוד. על התורה ועל העבודה ועל הנביאים ועל יום השבת הזה שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו לקדושה ולמנוחה, לכבוד ולתפארת. על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך, יתברך שמך בפי כל חי תמיד לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת. בוא תהיה. Okay, sure.
We turn back into our Sidurim.
Do you have a siddur here?
I believe it's page 179. We prepare to announce the new month of Elul, the month that includes our high holiday, or at the end of which we have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur at the start of the next month. The prayer for the new month, Birkat HaChodesh, can be found, I believe it's page 179, page 180. In your Siddur, please rise as the Torah was raised.
יהי רצון מלפניך אדוני אלוהינו באלוהי אבותינו ואימותינו, שחדש עלינו את החודש הבא לטובה ולברכה, ותיתן לנו חיים ארוכים, חיים של שלום, חיים של טובה, חיים של ברכה, חיים של פרנסה, חיים של חלוץ עצמות, חיים שיש בכם יראת שמיים ויראת חטא, חיים שהם בכם בושה וכלימה, חיים של עושר וכבוד, חיים שבנו אהבת תורה ויראת שמיים, חיים שימלאו וסלות ליבנו לטובה, אמן סלאם. ראש חודש אלול יהיה ביום שבת קודש ומחרתו ביום ראשון, הבא עלינו ועל כל ישראל לטובה. The new month of Elul begins on Shabbat and continues on Sunday of next week. Yehashehu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Aleinu v'kol amo Beit Yisrael l'chaim u'shalom v'sason u'simcha v'shua u'nechama v'nomar Amen.
Once the Torah is seated, you also may be seated. We call back up Judy Rudin to continue on Ashrei, page 181.
אשרי יושבי ביתך, עודך ללוכה סלע. תהילה לדוד, ארמינך אלוהיך מלך, אהבך שמך לעולם ועד. גדול אדוני ומהולל מאוד, בגדולתו אין חקר. והדר כבוד הודיך, בדברי נפלאותיך עשית. זכר רב טובך יביאו, בצדקתך ירננו. טוב אדוני לכל, ורחמיו על כל מעשיו. דבר מלכותך יאמרו, גבורתך ידברו. מלכותך מלכות כל עולמים, וממשלתך בכל דור ודור. עיני כל אליך יסברו, ואתה נותן לכם את אוכלם בעיתו. צדיק אדוני בכל דורך, וחסיד בכל מעשיו. רצון יראה יעשה, ואת שבתון נשמע ויושיעם. תהילת אדוני ידבר פי, ויברך כל בצע שם קודשו לעולם ועד. אנחנו נברך מעתה ועד עולם, הללויה. Hallelujah, et Shem Adonai, ki nizkach shemo levado. It's
I don't know if I introduced you. Okay, great.
My pleasure. It's now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi David Kunin, who arrived just a few days ago and must be beat. But I think he brought rain with him, so we should give him a wonderful hand just for that. Even if he gets all of his Hebrew from here on in, it's okay, he brought rain.
Yes, the rain is straight from Papua, where we were, and it rained every day in the dry season. Shabbat Shalom. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to be very careful, and I was told I spoke like a New Yorker yesterday. So I'm not going to speak, I can't help that, but I'm going to speak like a slow New Yorker, maybe someone from upstate. But I was from Syracuse, so someplace like that way speaks a little bit slower than those of us who are lucky enough to come from the city. But it's my pleasure to be here, and I'll speak in the microphone so that to ensure that everyone can hear me. So it's my pleasure to be here and join with you and hear the beautiful davening, and especially the young person who did such a beautiful job, with the Torah. It takes a conscious effort to speak slowly, which is a good conscious effort, something I need to work on. So it's my pleasure to be here and to think about the Torah reading that we just heard so beautifully chanted. I have to admit, in thinking about the Torah reading, the issue of reward and punishment came to my mind because the end of the Torah portion really deals with that issue. And it always bothers me. It's one of those issues where people take a nice mathematics and they say A plus B equals C. So if you have action, you have God's reaction, and then you have result. So they look at the world and they say, that person must have been bad, therefore God's punishing him or her. That person must be good, and so on and so on. And you have religious leaders who love this mathematics. So I remember not so long ago when Pat Robertson explained a terrible hurricane that hit Florida, that it hit Florida because Disney World had the effrontery to give their gay staff the same kinds of rights about inheritance and insurance as they gave their straight staff. And Pat Robertson obviously was horrified by this, so the hurricane destroyed lots of homes and killed people because God was punishing Florida because of Disney World. Now, it's of course, sadly, not only Christians who engage in mathematics, but also, I remember when I was younger, the chief rabbi of Petah Tikva explained a terrible tragedy in just this way. In Petah Tikva, there was a busload of yeshiva bochers, of very pious young men, and it was hit by a train, and many people on the bus, I think everybody was killed. Now, the chief rabbi of Petah Tikva said this was a divine punishment because there was a movie theater that was opening on Saturday night in Petah Tikva. Now, it was opening after Shabbat, but in order to get there for the first film, you had to leave on Shabbat. So this was the punishment. No, none of those yeshiva bochers would have gone to film at that theater. But even so, mathematics always works, and this was the reward and punishment that was set up for that event. So I've always been embarrassed by that, because it sounds to me always like religious leaders take their pet peeves and put them on God and on the world and explain terrible tragedies in ways that make no sense to me and make no sense about divine justice. Because how could there be a God who is just that punishes these yeshiva students for something they never were going to do? So it always puzzles me and bothers me. So I have to admit, last Shabbat, I was standing on the bima, and one of my congregants, who obviously listens carefully to my sermons, which was great in and of itself, came up to me and said, Rabbi, I was thinking about what you said last week about Tisha B'Av. Isn't that reward and punishment? And I had given a sermon where I had talked about how the rabbis in the Talmud explained Tisha B'Av as, especially the destruction of the second temple, as a result of Sinat Hinam and a lack of Derech Eretz, where people didn't treat each other with respect, and there was intercommunal hatred and violence, and that led to the destruction of the temple. Now, I first was mortified because he was absolutely right. Here I was, someone who was speaking about and thinking about reward and punishment and rejecting it largely, and I brought it up myself. But I thought about it a bit, and I realized that the rabbis in the Talmud, at least in that text, were not really interested in reward and punishment. But actually, in that case, they were interested in making a pedagogic, a teaching point, which said, we need to treat each other with respect. We need to get rid of intercommunal violence. And until we do that, well, nothing's going to change. And I think sitting here in the 21st century and looking at the Jewish world and how we treat each other and how we relate with other parts of the Jewish community, the rabbis are still right and we still get it wrong. That's a tragedy for us and something that we need to think about. But that comment last week led me to think about reward and punishment and what it means to me, and if I really totally reject the idea of reward and punishment. Now, if we read Deuteronomy as we did today in Parashat Eikev, we certainly see reward and punishment. We have a paragraph at the end of our reading today that talked about the idea that if we're good, it's going to rain, and if we're not, terrible things are going to happen. Reward and punishment at its most basic. And the Torah is filled with, especially Devarim, is filled with this idea of reward and punishment. And yet, even in the Bible, people began to question whether reward and punishment really works. And in Kohelet, they talk about everything being futile, futility and futility. The sun sets, the sun rises, nothing changes, nothing is new under the sun. Kohelet looks at the world, he realizes that reward and punishment doesn't work, that being very, very pious and doing all the mitzvot doesn't mean you can have a great life. And he rejects everything and looks at the world as futile and probably, maybe even rejects any understanding of his faith. Maybe. And then, of course, we look at the book of Job, and you have the same existential angst. as Job is punished for nothing. Job has done nothing wrong. He's a totally pious person. The Satan, a sort of controversial angel, tricks God into punishing Job and killing off his kids, destroying his crops, ruining his life. And Job's friends come to him and they say, you must have done something wrong, because otherwise none of this would have happened. And Job knows he hasn't done anything wrong, and he rejects these words from his friends. He rejects reward and punishment. And then at the end of the book, all God can say is a cop-out. You weren't there when I created the world, therefore you don't understand anything. That's not really an answer. God essentially is admitting that Job is right and that the world doesn't make sense. And in the Talmud, we have both options. We have rabbis who look at the world with simple mathematics, but we have also rabbis who look at the world in a more complex way. And so in one text, they look at the afterlife as the great solver of reward and punishment. So in the Talmud, it says that the evil get all their reward in this world. That's why they do well here. And the good get all their reward in the next. It's not very much of a satisfying answer. So I began to think about it, and at first, and probably for many years, I've rejected reward and punishment as a useful theological construct. But over the last few years, I've begun to realize that actually, if we remove God from the equation, reward and punishment actually is a very important thing for us to consider. So I want to just ask, before I posit perhaps my answer, maybe you'll give it to me first, if anybody has any suggestions about how we might take this ancient Jewish theological concept and see it as meaningful for us as modern Jews living in the 21st century. Yeah? Absolutely. And let me get some other answers and then I'll come back to that one. Yeah. She said every act has consequences. Yes.
We have free will.
We have free will. Another aspect of the same answer. Absolutely. Anybody else? Yeah. Is it possible or impossible to understand God? That's a different answer I'm not going to address today, but that goes back to Job, that ultimately God's justice is maybe beyond our ken, and therefore we have to just look at the world and accept it. Absolutely. Yeah.
You burn fossil fuels, you would
Absolutely. One more? Anybody else? Yeah. Inaction also has consequences. So you've all gone to the same place I went, which is ultimately the word of punishment is true. But it's not God who causes the punishment. We ourselves cause our own punishments, and actually we ourselves also cause our own reward. Does anybody remember the movie Pay It Forward? So in Pay It Forward, you had somebody doing a good deed, and then they pay it forward to other people, and onward and onward and onward. So, and that actually was something that they may have gotten right from the Talmud. Because in the Talmud it says, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. One mitzvah leads to another mitzvah. Each of our actions, which creates a better world, that works l'tekeno olam b'malchut Bnai, that works to create a world in God's image, makes the world a bit of a better place. And there's ripple effects, that those ripples can spread to the whole world and transform it. Also, when we see catastrophes, if we don't look at it and try to find the equation, but instead react with justice, with mercy, with compassion, then our actions are transforming that for the people who are suffering. So our actions make a difference, and our actions for good have a consequence. And I think that part we often forget, that our good actions too are important, and when we fail to act for good, then we're moving towards the other side. We're more to the dark side of the force. And in that case, also our actions for ill have dramatic consequences, not only for ourselves, but for future generations. So we heard about the fossil fuels and other aspects of environmental degradation that we ourselves are responsible for as a human race. And we think about what are the consequences of those actions. Well, the consequences are already starting a little bit, at least according to some. Now, when we were in Papua, in the dry season, there were torrential rains every day. And scientists in Indonesia look at that as an aspect of global warming. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but certainly it was totally untypical. Just before I left Japan, there were massive wildfires that spread all across Australia that were unlike wildfires that that continent had ever seen. And some scientists have suggested that that's due to climate change. So we think about those results that are happening now, maybe the long drought we have here, but also, what is it the consequences for future generations? What is the world that we're creating through our action and often our inaction? There are real consequences and real punishments, and it's our children and grandchildren that are going to suffer those consequences as the world becomes harder and harder to live in. So taking responsibility for the world in whatever way we choose, that helps to transform, and then the reward is that we create a world that will be a place where we, our grandchildren, and our great-great-grandchildren can live in peace in the world, in the land, in the world that the eternal our God has given us. So reward and punishment have amazing relevance even for today. But instead of looking at God as meting out the punishment, we have to realize that we met out the reward and we met out the punishment as well. Shabbat Shalom. I believe I'm doing Musaf, is that correct? Yeah. So we're going to continue now with Musaf, beginning with the Hatzi Kaddish, which is found on the bottom of page 184 in our Siddurim. I have to say, I'm trying to get out of the habit. We announce 2 or sometimes even 3 Siddurim because people on Zoom are sometimes in the wrong books. So I'm really glad that I only have to announce 1 page here.
You can only afford 1 book.
I wish they could only afford 1 book. Yikadal v'yikadash shemei Rabbi v'yamad divrach irutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon yomechon u'chayei v'chol beit Yisrael Ba'agala u'bizman kariv b'imru Amen. Yehi shmei Rabbi mivorach L'yol me'almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitman v'yitnasei v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal Shemei d'kodisha b'richu le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata tushbecha v'nechemata damiran b'yalma b'meru Amen. Please rise if you're comfortable as we turn to the silent Amidah, page 185, and please feel free to be seated when you come to the end. So we're going to turn now to the repetition of Musaf Amidah, page 185. If anybody has not completed the Amidah, please feel free to continue as we begin the repetition. Please rise if you're comfortable. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu, Elohei Avoteinu v'Imoteinu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Elohei Leah, Hayel Hagadol, Chibor Banora, El Elyon, Gomel Asadim, Tovim, Bekonei Hakol, V'zocher Chastei Avot B'imahot, U'meidi Goel Nebneihem, Leman Shemo Ba'ahava, Melech Ozef Kedem Oshio Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Abraham, Ked Sarah, Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechayei Metim Atah Rab Loshia, Morid Hatal, Mechalkel Chayim Bechesed, Mechayei Metim Berachamim Rabim, Somet Noklim Berofech Olim, Umatir Asurim, Kayem Emunato Lishenei Afar Micha Mocha Bal Gevuro Umido Melech Menihi Umechayeh Umatzmiach Yeshua Neman Atala Hachayot Metim Baruch atah Adonai Mechayei Ametim. You don't have to go see yourself. Just watch yourselves. Naritzecha Nafdishcha Yesozia Sarfei Kodesh Amakdishim Shemcha B'Kodesh Kakatu Ayad Neviyecha Bekara Zel Zeva Amar Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzevaot Oloch La'aretz Kevodo Ma'ale Le'olam Aye Mekom Kevodo Vodo Ma'ale Olam Aye Mekom Kevodo Ma'ale Olam Meshartav Shoalim Zelazeh Aye Mekom Kevodo Meshartav Shoalim Zelazeh Aye Mekom Kevodo Lamatam Baruch Yomeru Baruch Kivod Adonai, Mihim Kohomo, Uyi Berachami, Beyachon Am Yachadim Shemo, Erev Avoker, Bechol Yom Tami, Pa'amayim Ba'ava, Shema Omrim, Shema Israel. Adonai Echad, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hu Eloheinu, Hu Avinu, Hu Malkeinu, Hu Moshienu, Hu Yashmienu, Berachamav Sheni, Sheni Yene Kol Chai Yot Lachem Lelokim Ani Adonai Elohechem U'Divrei Kodechecha Katuv Lemor Adonai Le'olam Elohai Hitzion L'dor v'ador Hallelujah Moch Adonai Le'olam Elohai Hitzion L'dor v'ador Hallelujah L'dor v'ador L'dor v'ador L'dor v'ador Nagi Kolecha L'dor v'ador L'dor v'ador L'dor v'ador Nagi Kolecha U'netzach netzachim Kedushatecha naktish Kedushatecha naktish B'shemchacha Eloheinu Mipinu lo yamush le'olam va'ed L'dor v'ador L'dor v'ador L'dor v'ador Nagi Kolecha L'dor v'ador L'dor v'ador L'dor v'ador Nagi Kolecha Ki el melech gadol v'kadosh ata Ki el melech gadol v'kadosh ata Baruch atah Adonai ha'el hamelech ha'el ha'kadosh. Please feel free to be seated. Continue on page 188a. Tikanta Shabbat ratzita korbanotecha, tzivita perushecha im tzirei nisachecha, yangecha leolam kevod yinchalu, tomecha chayim zachu, v'gam ahavim devarecha gedula bacharu, al misinai nitztavu alecha, v'titzavim Adonai Eloheinu, lakribat korban musaf Shabbat karawi. Yiratzon melpanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu ameshiv banim kulam sheta'aleinu b'simcha la'artseinu v'tita'enu b'gvulenu sheshamasu avotenu v'imotenu lepanecha et korbanotechem Amidim kisidram, musafim kihilchatam. Musaf, Yom HaShabbat Hazeh, Asu hikrivu lepanecha, v'avat mitzvat ritzonecha, kakatu b'tortecha, ayidei Moshe avdecha, mipik vodecha, kamor. Yom HaShabbat, Shnei kivasim b'nei shanat tamimim, u'shnei esronim zolet, min chavelula v'shemen, b'nihizko. Olat Shabbat b'Shabbato, Alolat Tamid b'Nizko. Yismechu b'Malechutecha, Shomrei Shabbat b'Korei Oneg Shabbat. Yismechu b'Malechutecha, Shomrei Shabbat b'Korei Oneg Shabbat. Aha Mekadeshei Shevi Shabbat Kulam Yisba'u V'yitagu Metuvecha Shabbat Yismechu b'Malechutecha Shomrei Shabbat Korei Oneg Shabbat Yismechu b'Malechutecha Shomrei Shabbat Korei Oneg Shabbat Bashvi'i Ratzita bo B'Kidashto Shabbat Emdat Yamim Oto Karata Shabbat Zecher L'Masei Bereshit Eloheinu V'Elohei Avotenu Ritzei B'Mnuchatenu Kachenu B'Mitzvotecha V'Tein Helkeinu B'Toratecha Sabe'enu Metuvecha V'Samchenu B'Shuatecha V'Taher Libeinu La'avdecha Be'emet V'chanchi leinu Adonai Eloheinu V'ahava uvratzon Shabbat Kodshecha V'yanuchu v'Yisrael Mekadshei Shemecha Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat Ritzei Adonai Eloheinu ba'amcha Yisrael Gilatam V'shev Eladad Levir Beitecha Gilatam ba'avad tikabel b'ratzon V'kil ratzon tamid avadak Yisrael Amecha V'techazena Eineinu V'shuvcha L'Tzion V'rachamim Baruch atah Adonai Machazir Shchinato L'Tzion. Or on page 190, the congregation chants quietly the paragraph in small print. Modim anachnu lach, shetach Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avoteinu v'imotenu ve'olam va'ed, tzor chayinu magen yishenu, atal ador v'ador nodeh lecha nesaper tilatecha, al hayenu mesrim b'yadecha, v'yanish motenu b'kirot lach, v'al nisecha sheb'chol yom imanu, v'al niflotecha v'tovotecha, v'chol eit erevoket zohorayim, Atol chilo chalu rachamecha, Amachem kilo tamu azadecha, Elam kevihinu laha. V'al kulam yitbarak b'imam shemcha malkeinu tamu le'olam va'ed. V'chol ha'imuducha sela, V'alu et shemcha ba'emet, Ayel shwatenu v'ezratenu sela, Baruch atah Adonai, Atol shecha lecha na'eh, Baruch atah Adonai, Atol shecha lecha na'eh le'hodot. Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu Barucheinu bracha meshuleshet b'Torah k'tuva al yedei Moshe avdecha ha'amura mipi Aharon uvanav kohanim am kidoshecha ka'amohor yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'huneka yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yosem lecha shalom. Sim shalom ba'olam tova uvracha hein v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael amecha Barucheinu avinu kulanu ke'echad be'or panecha ki be'or panecha natata lanu Adonai Eloheinu Sim shalom ba'olam tova uvracha ein v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael amecha Torah chayim v'ahavat chesed utzdacha uvracha v'rachamim v'chayim v'shalom Sim shalom b'ol olam tova uvracha hein v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael amecha v'tov be'einecha levarech et amcha Yisrael b'chol eit u'b'chol sha'a b'shlomecha Sim shalom ba'olam tova uvracha ein v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael amecha Baruch atah Adonai v'barech amo Yisrael b'shalom. And we continue now with the Kaddish Shalem, which is on page 201, I believe. No, 203. Yekidal v'yekadash shmei Rabbi, Yomad divrach elutem lech malchutei, v'chayachon yomachon chayachon beit Yisrael, v'agulav ezman kvemru, Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbi mivorach, v'yolam v'yom me'al maya, yitbarach, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitman v'yitnasei, Yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shmei d'kodisha b'richu leila min kol birchata v'shirata tushchata nachamata damran ba'ama v'emru Amen. Tikabel soton v'aton d'chol Yisrael k'adam avahon yishmaya v'emru Amen. Yehei shlama ramin shemai v'chayim Aleinu v'kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav, uyaseh shalom. Aleinu v'kol Yisrael kol yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen. So we continue now with En Keloheinu, page 204. En Keloheinu, En Kadonenu, En Kemalkeinu, En Kemoshienu, Micheloheinu, Michadonenu, Michemalkeinu, Michemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adonenu, Nodel Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atachu Eloheinu, Adonenu, Atachu Malkeinu, Atachu Moshienu, Atachu Shektiru, Lavotenu, Lebahanecha, Ketoret Hasami. Please rise if you're comfortable for Aleinu. Aleinu Meshabeach, Vadon HaChol, Vateikula, Yotzer Bereshit, Shelo Asanu Kidwei Aratot, Shelo Samanu K'nishpachot Ha'ama, Shelo Sam Elkeinu Kahem, V'gol Aleinu K'chol Amonam, V'anachnu Korim, U'mishtacharim, Lifnei Melech, Malchei Hamlachim, Akadosh Baruch Hu, Shehu Notei Shamayim, Yosed Haaretz, U'Moshe V'Yikaro Hashamayim Mima'al, U'Shchinatu Zo, V'Goav Hei Meromim, Hu Eloheinu Einod, Emet Malkeinu Efezulato, Kakatuv B'Torato, V'yadata Chayom V'chashevota Elevavecha, Ki Adonai Hua Elohim, B'Shamayim Mima'al, Yaharetz, Yaharetz, Yitachat Eino. Kakatu b'tortecha, Adonai Yimloch le'olam va'ed, v'ne'emar, v'chaya Adonai, v'melech al kol ha'aretz, v'yom hahu, yeh Adonai echad, u'shemo echad. Please feel free to be seated. Today we lovingly remember the following Yortzites, which fall today and the week to come. We think especially of Donald Kaufman, Daniel Spector, Ida Feit, Herman Schwartz, Andrew Nagin, Irving Pitkovsky, Humphrey Fight Ballard Neisel, Kate Baskin, and Esther Kaufler. May their memories be a blessing. As any observing Yortzei morning, please rise if you're comfortable to recite the Kaddish. Yit Gadal, Yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah, Yalmad, Divarah, Lerutei, Hayachon, Yomechon, Hayeh, Bagalah, Vizman Kari, Benu, Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah, Vivarach, Le'olam, Amei Almaya. Yit Barak, Yit Pa'ar, Yit Ramam, Yit Nas, Yit Tadar, Yit Taleh, Yit Talal, Shemei B'Kadisha, B'Riyah, Eila, Mikol, Birchata, B'Shirat, Shchata, B'Nehmata, B'Mram Ba'oma, B'Mru, Amen. Shvama, Rabba, Min, Shemai V'Chaim, Aleinu V'Al Kol Yisrael, Says Ben Ramad, Booyah says Shalom. Alei, Yalkol Yisrael, Yalkol Yisrael Tebel, Ben Ru, Amen.
Shabbos, everyone. I'd like to thank all of our participants for a beautiful service. And we are going to continue tonight, starting at 6:30 for the Seudah Shlishit dinner, which is by reservation. And at 7:30, which is open to everybody, the study session with Rabbi Kunin. And at 8:30, family-friendly Havdalah led by Rabbi Kunin. So we have kind of a busy late afternoon and evening as well. The same schedule will be followed next week. So kind of keep that in mind, and please try to keep your white reminder handy so that you know what's going on. Yes. Yeah, the Harvey is always good for a reminder. And he did remind me to introduce Shelley. Thank you, Shelley, for everything you're doing as well. And so next Sunday, we also are having a very important meeting, which is going to be at 5:30, at which time the congregation, all members, people who are in good standing in the show, members of the congregation will be allowed to vote for our new rabbinic leadership. And one other thing that I'd like to mention, I know I don't want to put too many dates in your head, it's getting kind of late in the service, but on September 18th, we are going to have a dedication of a brand new Torah for us. And this is something that doesn't happen every day. This is something that is really magnificent and marvelous and a true mitzvah. And it's coming in from Israel, and the Sofer is coming along with it. And he is going to allow us 80 spots, 80 letters to fulfill the completion of the Torah. You will have an opportunity to write a letter. Inscribe the letter, the Sofer will, as he inscribes the letter on the Torah. Now, we mentioned something. We have lots of bills here in the synagogue. We pay electric bills, water bills, and everything else. But I'm about to talk about the funds from this will not go towards that. Funds that we raise from the inscription will go to a brand new fund. It'll be the religious school, some kind of supplementary fund for the religious school, for trips, for outings, for guest speakers, things like that, to kind of supplement the Greenfeld Fund. So here you are providing yourself with the mitzvah, describing the Torah, describing the future, in a sense, for our religious school students. This comes at a cost, I think. It's $180. So keep that in mind, and please, if it's something that you would like to do, email me, or just call the office and say, I'd like to inscribe the Torah, the inscription, and I will know money is going to go. We hope to have pretty sizable fund as a result of this endeavor. Thank you again, and we'll see you later on tonight, and good Shabbos, everyone. Oh, and be sure you come to the Kiddush right after services downstairs. Yes? Oh, yes, and, no matter how good my list is, there's always something. Rabbi Kunin will now invite you to ask some questions, and we'll have a question and answer session, just as we had last night. Rabbi Kunin.
That'll be after Jonah.
Just after I go.
So we're going to continue with Adon Olam and then questions. And Adon Olam is found on page 211. Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra, Adon Olam, La'eit Nasa, B'chefso Kol, Azai Melech Shemo Nivra, Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol, Yitzir Nivra, Liet Nasa, Bechef Sokol, Azai Melech Shemon Nikra Adon Olam, B'yacharei Kechlot HaKol, Levado Yemlok Nora Adon Olam, B'hu Haya, B'hu Hoveh, B'hu Yeh B'tifara Adon Olam, Hashem Ach, B'terem Kol, Yitzir Nivra, Liet Nasa, B'chef Sokol, Azai Melech Shemon Nikra Adon Olam, B'hu Echad, B'yein Sheni, Laham Shilo Lahakbira Adon Olam, B'li Reishi, B'li Tachli, B'lo Ha'oz B'cham Yisra Adon Olam, Hashem Allah, B'terem Kol, Yitzir Nivra, B'yein Nasa, B'chef Sokol, Azai Melech Shemon Nikra Adon Olam, B'hu Echad, B'yein Sheni, Lacham Shilo Lahakbira Adon Olam, B'li Reishi, B'li Tachli, B'lo Ha'oz B'cham Yisra Adon Olam, Hashem Allah, B'terem Kol, Yitzir Nivra, B'yein Nasa, B'chef Sokol, Azai Melech Shemon Nikra Adon Olam, B'hu Eli, B'chai Goali, B'tzorchev Li B'yein Tzara Adon Olam, B'hu Nisi, Umanos Li, Manat Kosi B'yom Mekra Adon Olam, Hashem Allah, B'terem Kol, Yitzir Nivra, Liet Nasa, B'chef Sokol, Azai Melech Shemon Nikra Adon Olam, B'ya'ado, Avki Ruchi, B'yeti Sham B'ya'ira Adon Olam, B'im Ruchi, Gaviyati, Adonai Livalo, Ira Adon Olam. Kiddush. So please rise if you're comfortable. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam b'ridolam. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam b'ridolam. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael oti le'olam oti le'olam. V'shamru Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam b'ridolam. Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et ha-shamayim v'et ha'aretz. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam b'ridolam. Yom HaShvi, Shabbat v'napash, Shabbat v'napash, Shabbat v'yinapash. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam b'ridolam. If anybody wanted to follow, it's on page 77. Al Kein Barach Adonai et Yom HaShabbat Yikadshehu Savri Marotai Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Borei Pri Hagafen. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz.
Okay, I guess we can open it up for any questions you might have of Rabbi Kunin. And please come up, or I'll look for Russell here. And, oh, okay, you're going to do that. Great. Hold your question for another minute.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I just wanted to remind everyone, on September 21st, we are having a tea with the Albuquerque Hadassah, and we're bringing Faye Kellerman here. I don't know why this is happening. We're having Faye Kellerman, and we're having a tea, and she will be on Zoom. However, it is, we will have her very last book that she is writing about, I guess it's Decker, the detective, and it's the last in the series, and it's coming out this month. And we will be discussing that book, and also about what it's like to be a Jewish mystery author. So that's September 21st, and just keep that in mind, and you should be getting information about it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
And while we're waiting for the microphone, I just will mention that, can you hear me? Yeah, that speaking slowly is going to be a work, if you decide to bring me, will be my first focus as a work in progress, because you can take New York, but you never can read. I think we're getting feedback, yes.
Okay, maybe we can just get started. If you speak loud, we can.
Do I still have feedback? No, good.
Questions?
If you say the question, then I'll repeat it, so that way the people on Zoom can hear it.
Hi, my name is Marissa Wald. Something that's very important to me is that our leadership is very welcoming to interfaith couples, to our LGBTQ community, to people of different abilities. And I just wonder if you could speak to the ways that you will create a hopefully a welcoming atmosphere to all different kinds of people of different Jewish practice in our community, because we're a pretty diverse place.
Well, I actually agree with you. I think that that's the most important challenge for Judaism in the 21st century. And I'm a little embarrassed that I think for the conservative movement, we were a bit slower off the mark than other parts of the community. So I think that it's extremely important, and I think the synagogue has to be welcoming in every way, so that welcoming in every way it treats people, so that one of the things that I've encouraged in Syracuse is that when just a stranger being welcomed to that is the first step, so that when people come into the synagogue, not only showing them where we are in the book, but even taking them and sitting them with somebody who, so that they're not sitting alone, and that they feel that they're part of a community. And for me, that's the most important thing that we can do. Every time we can make ourselves a warm and welcoming community, then then it's only for, it will work for growth, it'll work for a stronger community. So one of the things that the hardest challenge is when you see people at a Kiddush and they're sitting in their little groups, and encouraging people to welcome the stranger to their table and include them in their discussion is a very important way of creating that kind of warm and welcoming community. And obviously, we live in a very complicated world now, and making sure that we make everybody feel comfortable, so that in 2 weeks we're having a bar mitzvah in Syracuse. So that there's a young woman, she has very, very strong ideas about the world she wants to live in. And so she doesn't want a bat mitzvah, but she wants a bar mitzvah. And helping her to enjoy and celebrate her bar mitzvah, even to creating a bar mitzvah certificate, which doesn't exist anywhere yet, is a way of helping her to feel like we're embracing her values and allowing her to feel comfortable in our community. I have been a long proponent of same-sex marriage, as well as making same-sex couples feel welcome in the synagogue, as well as people who make many, many different choices, saying that there's no choice that we're afraid of, but instead we embrace and welcome people to our community and want them to feel that. It was actually, I was really pleased when I was in Edmonton. There was, Canada has a reputation of being a bit staid and a bit old-fashioned, and I can't claim responsibility for this, but I was really pleased when there was a young woman she actually was transitioning to be a young woman. She was about 10 feet tall and rather awe-inspiring in that sense, and the congregation went out of their way to make her feel welcome in the congregation and to treat her with respect. So that, and that was, it was an eye-opener for me about the nature of that community, but also that was the way I knew that I wanted Jewish communities to be, so that everybody feels welcome and respected, no matter where we're coming from, we're all part of the Jewish community. It was a real challenge in Asia in a different way, where we had a lot of young people who were half Japanese or half Chinese, and we had to find ways to help them to feel a full part of the Jewish world, which often was complicated. You go to Israel and they wouldn't know. Maybe we just turn off the extra mics. You go to Israel and they wouldn't even, there's Japanese Jews, I didn't know that. But one of the things, so we wanted them to realize that they weren't alone, because when they came back to America and went to Jewish camps, which they often did, no one had ever seen a Japanese Jew or a Chinese Jew before. So we actually started our Shabbaton program, where we brought together kids from all over Asia for 2 Shabbats a year in different communities. We'd fly a bunch of kids into different places, just so they could really get a community of people who had Asian parents, so they could realize that they were a full part of the Jewish community and that there was a support for them. So I think the more we can do in every aspect of making people feel welcome, the better it is. Also, it was a great way to build their teen identity too, which was as Jews, which is great too.
Yes. Yes, you are joining us.
Yes, of course. So that will be time for private questions then as well. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I've always believed. Oh, yeah. So thank you for reminding me. So the question was, when, if you decide to bring me to Albuquerque, would I make it a habit to stay till the end of Kiddush so that we could have Birkat Hamazon and study sessions occasionally? And that's absolutely true. It's something I feel very important about. I feel I think it's, actually it was in the Torah portion recently where we actually had the commandment, I think actually in the beginning of this Torah portion, the part we didn't read, where the command for Birkat Hamazon is found, where it says, after you've eaten and been satisfied, you should thank the eternal your God. And so eating without the Birkat Hamazon for me is missing a chance to say thank you. But also I think that it's important for the rabbi to be there, and my wife Shelley and me to be there, to be with people, to help welcome people to the community, but also to connect with, on an ongoing way, the members of the community. So I think that's very important, absolutely.
Anyone else?
Although, let me add one thing. I actually used to resent my mother. Because my mother, when I was a kid, my mother was always the last person to leave the Kiddush. Now I understand her.
Any other questions? Do we have yes, Marty.
Rabbi, I think one of the important roles of the synagogue is to instill Jewish values in our young people. I wonder if you agree with what you think the rabbi's role is.
Absolutely, I think that's really, really important. So that, so the question is instilling Jewish values in young people, and what's the role of the rabbi in that? So I think the rabbi has many, many different roles in that. so that I think sermons within the congregation, when especially young people are there, are always about trying to instill Jewish values and to help people to understand how to live fulfilling Jewish lives. Because to me, if parents are doing it, and when the rabbi connects with parents modeling is the best way to pass it on. So that's really, really important. But then on a more direct level, I've always tried to take advantage when I do tefillah for the whole Hebrew school to do a little bit of a teaching. And so that is a way to reach everyone at a fairly simple level. But then I think working with the principal to ensure that the curriculum has a strong values component to it. And then I've always thought of the bar and bat mitzvah class as the biggest opportunity to do that, because the young people are becoming Jewish adults. And for me, what it means to be a Jewish adult is to make Jewish ethical choices and to have that become a pattern for their lives. So that I've always used a curriculum that embraces Jewish ethics as the primary aspect of what I teach in my bar mitzvah classes, and for other classes as well. So I think that's enormously important. So the question is, what are my thoughts on a pre-service Torah study? So when I grew up in a Reformed congregation in Westchester County, New York, and they didn't have a Saturday morning service most weeks unless it was a bar mitzvah. And so that's exactly what they did. So starting when I was 14, I started after my bar mitzvah. We went very regularly, my brother and I, who's also a rabbi, and we went to Torah study, and all the way through the time we were still in Croton, and then when we came back to visit, we'd often join. So that set a really important, it really set a model for me that Torah study and having people think about and have a discussion rather than the rabbi teaching, but having a general where we read a verse, and sometimes in the Torah study you only do one verse, and the whole hour, or whatever amount of time you have dedicated to it, is just people sharing how they think about that one verse. Sometimes you get through more, sometimes there are aspects of the Torah that are upsetting that you need to deal with in a very, both in the sermons actually as well, but you need to deal with. So I think that's a really wonderful thing to do, and I think that it's a really great model. I would love to do that. Yeah.
Give us your thoughts on how important it would be to have a library in the
Okay. How important is it for there to be a synagogue library? I actually, one of the great tragedies of synagogues is how many synagogues have wonderful libraries, and they're the least used room in the library, in the synagogue, unless the board has its meetings there. And in fact, in my mother's synagogue, they actually have gotten rid of the library, which I think is an even bigger tragedy. And they turned it into a boardroom. I think having a good, well-rounded synagogue library is enormously important. And one of the things that I did, that I've done, especially in Japan, when I was teaching the bar mitzvah class, is I would also often give them projects where they would have to go to the library and use books from the library to do the presentations for the rest of the class. So I think getting kids, and I think probably in Hebrew school, having time where the kids go into the library and pick a book to take home for that, just like you do in public school, is a great way of people getting used to using the synagogue library. And then with adult education, taking advantage of the library, so I think you're getting my point, that I think it's enormously important to have, it's enormously important to be well-rounded, but it's a tragedy because sometimes they're not used nearly as much as they should be, because they're they have enormous potential to benefit a Jewish community, and I think we need to take advantage of that.
Okay, let's go downstairs and have our Kiddush. Shabbat.
Shabbat shalom. Oh, thank you.
Nice job.
Oh, thank you.
It's a long morning.
It really is.
It's a long morning.
That's what Shabbat afternoon is. After a long morning, then you have to teach that.
At least it's a comfortable place.
Yeah, it's lovely. Although, if I had to sit again, actually, no, I think they ought to maybe sit further in the back, or maybe easier to get down. The chairs are very low down in the front.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, here, we're speaking to a lot of people. They have their seats. The regular
Yes, they
people,
do.
they have their seats. They don't want to move.
Yeah.
You can urge them and push them, force them. You'll be excommunicated if you don't move.
That's true.
It's
Jewish
fine.
communities everywhere.
Fine. Excommunicate. Not moving.
And they call it a kavua.
Yeah. Place.